out!
Hello, little men. In the D&D celebrity tier list, dwarves are literally the only ones that can come close to elves. They both belong to that Tolkien A-list fantasy guys group that even your uncle, whose only exposure to fantasy was Game of Thrones, is familiar with. And yet elves are about 100 times more popular than dwarves by D&D Beyond metrics, not only beaten by the supermodels of the forest, but by Charizard, Ebony Darkness Dementia Ravenway, and half models. Not to mention the ever-popular vanilla ice cream. Why? What makes dwarves markedly less popular? Well, I'm Antonio D'Amico, this is Pointy, and that's what we're gonna find out today. And on top of that, we're gonna try to fix it and give you something you can take home with you to show said Game of Thrones uncle in this brand new episode of D&D with a twist, Dwarf Edition. So when I think of dwarves, I think of...
Shout it, what your name is?
Dwarf is the species for Minecraft kids, guys that got a little too into Vikings, hopefully not in a weird way, and bears. No, not like the actual animal. No, not that either. You know what? Whatever. If you know, you know. So like the philosopher kings we are, we have to ask ourselves, what is dwarf? Before we can change anything. So what is it? What is this hairy little man? Well, dwarves are such a fantasy staple that it feels weird to define them. But we gotta, because every setting that adds them feels the need to tweak them and make them different from the Tolkien ones, since we've seen those to death. So what does D&D do to our dear manlets? In D&D, dwarves stand under 5 feet tall, but make no mistake, these boys are dense. As a matter of fact, they count as a medium creature just by virtue of being very chunky. Dwarves are also among the D&D species with the longest lifespan, clocking in at around 4 centuries. This is barely past the halfway point of the 7 centuries attributed to elf lifespans, and slightly less than gnomish lifespans, which clock in at 5 centuries. So dwarves can't even get second place, huh? Whatever, I'm not bitter. Anyway, other than their status as short kings, dwarves are known for their beards. If you're a cool writer like the guy that wrote Lord of the Rings, or if you're an even cooler writer like Pratchett, both sexes of dwarves can grow facial hair. And if you're a coward, they can't. In D&D, whether female dwarves can grow beards or not is a hotly debated topic by people that care. Me? I care. It's me and 4 other weirdos debating this. This is the non-furry version of the furry debate over Dragonborn tails, or Argonian maid chest assets. In 2nd edition, it's plainly stated that female dwarves do grow beards, but this is just omitted later on, as in it's not said that they don't, but it's not mentioned that they do again. And I don't think I've seen a single official illustration of a female dwarf with so much as stubble, which is a travesty, so it falls on to me to fix that, I guess. I've done this in this channel before. Why? Because I'm not a coward. Regardless of bravery, dwarves are known for their impeccable hair game, as an inordinate amount of text is dedicated to describing exactly how braided and styled and coiffed and laid their hair is. Dwarves also subscribe to the 22 inches or else you're bald school of hair length, as they culturally keep it as long as possible.
I felt like a Puerto Rican in this hair.
All this to say, PSA, put a dwarf hair show in your D&D campaign, or else. Culturally, dwarves are massively into community. They are structured in clans, but this is less actual world building and more dwarves have been assigned Scottish accents in fantasy media and we're running with it. Like, there's barely any info as to what these clans are or how they work. It's just a word that feels vaguely Scottish, like deep frying. What we do know is that they work like you would expect, as in, it's a hereditary thing to figure out who rules a clan, and that it's all about respecting your elders like a good little boy that goes to the quarry on time and eats his rocks. This whole thing is also mirrored in their propensity for piety. Dwarves are explicitly stated to be more into religion than the average D&D species. This tracks with their assigned D&D class being paladin and all. I've seen people say that this makes it so that all dwarves must be religious, and no, that's not what that means. This means that their societies tend to be religious, which immediately opens you up to tell stories of characters that struggle with this, or explore why would someone would embrace that so strongly. Yes, I'm using this again. If you think about it, clans and religions point towards a common trait of dwarven culture. Dwarves are extremely community driven. They have divvied themselves up into organized societies since basically the beginning of time, with some dwarven settlements and cities dating back to literally the beginning of time. This sort of translates into how dwarven society itself is structured. Big into tradition, big into hard work and learning a craft, big into community above the individual, big into justice, and big into looking at you sideways if you dare to jailwalk. It's all very German-esque. Germans knew how to have fun and not stare at people. The beard aspect is there though, we'll talk about it. I think a lot of people just assign elves the smart species archetype and forget that dwarves care basically just as much about knowledge. But dwarves are more capitalist about it, more liberal about it. Dwarves care about skill, about applying knowledge in a practical way. Basically, they're up there with humans when it comes to being industrious. Dwarven society is less likely to reward knowledge for knowledge's sake than elven society is, but dwarves will 100% reward someone that is knowledgeable enough to contribute something, anything useful to the community. They will see that person as a hero. What that something that they contribute is depends on the dwarf. But dwarven society cares a whole lot about mining and crafting. If you've seen literally any fantasy thing ever in the last century, you're vaguely familiar with this, but listen up because I'm 100% using this later. Dwarves are intrinsically connected to the earth and more specifically to the stone. There's even an obscure dwarven belief that believes that dwarves themselves, as a species, were carved out of stone itself, and boy do I like that a whole lot. A whole lot. Dwarven kingdoms stretch underground, not on the surface, so stonecraft and masonry are like massively important to them. The dwarves, just like our children, long for the mines. They also care a whole lot about using set stone, not just building with it, so mining gems and metals and other things you find in Minecraft and forging them into artifacts that you can then throw at your players like a dog toy when they get restless. All of those are also extremely important in dwarven society. Boy, do they care a whole lot about gemstones and metals and forging gemstones and metals into magical things. Boy, oh boy, do they care. Hint, hint, I'm using this later. Because dwarves are all about forging extremely powerful artifacts, one has to wonder what they got there stashed under those piles of rocks. There are whispers of blades that can cut through stone like it was butter. Horns that when blown can break an entire tunnel of stone as far as sound can carry. Shovels that always point towards precious stones. But even older legends say that all of these items come from one unique item. An item made as part of a forge that brings magic into the world. What item is this? Well, the World Anvil, of course. World Anvil is a channel favorite, and that's for a reason. It's your one-stop shop for actually getting things done, whether it be for GMing or playing, novel writing, streaming, everything. That's right, not just for DMs. It's an amazing tool that helps with literally all of them. If you're telling anything, any story, this is for you. It's just so easy for your world and characters to just exist in your head as a nebulous concept and never really get out of there. And for the lore you create to never actually come to anything. And that's what World Anvil is here to help you fix. With World Anvil, by just going to worldanvil.com, you can organize your world as your own custom wiki with different articles for different factions, countries, NPCs, everything you can think of, and pin all of those in literally an interactive map of your world that you or your players could use. And if you're a player, you have everything you need for your PCs or your OCs with the most extensive character managing tools you can find. You can write journals for your characters after sessions, manage your inventory, create your family line to keep track of how many cousins you tell people you have, and they offer 5e support, which means that you can actually use game mechanics here. And they also support like 45 plus game systems, which makes it an amazing tool for GMing and playing. It's just good, and you can try it now. The baseline version is for free. So if this does sound good, you get a code, a 51% off code for any yearly subscription to World Anvil. Just type Pointy at all one word at checkout. You can find World Anvil and the link in the description. And now that we've talked about crafting and forging, we're gonna talk public relations, foreign affairs if you will. Dwarves are known for being stubborn. They are very dad-coded. They don't like to ask directions. So it might be surprising to find out that they're probably the chillest when it comes to interspecies relations. It's a shame, really, that half-elf is the mixed ancestry poster boy of D&D, because by all accounts, there should be 10 half-dwarves for every half-elf running around complaining about not fitting in anywhere despite being unearthly beautiful and blessed with naturally produced Ozempic.
Don't hate me because I'm beautiful.
Dwarven settlements, just like human settlements, feature a ton of diversity of species. Maybe it's because they literally made the first settlements, and unlike elves, they're not wary of other species. Wonder what that is code for. So those that didn't have their together were of course flocking to where dwarves lived. In D&D lore, nearly every species gets along at least okay with dwarves. It's sort of a spectrum that goes from BFFs to they can hang, I guess. Dwarves see gnomes as basically cousins, considering that gnomes also come from underground and have a connection to gemstones in obscure lore. Some dwarves even believe gnomes and dwarves to basically have a common ancestor. How odd. How interesting. There's also the whole invention angle of gnomes, and though gnomes generally get into crafting because they got bored for 4.5 seconds, so they decided to invent the printing press, and not because the gnomish spirit is particularly industrious, dwarves can very much respect the results. On the other hand, dwarves see halflings as like younger siblings. Dwarves have no problem going to war and fighting if there's need for that, and halflings are like the polar opposite of that. So dwarves often help halflings when halflings get into trouble that their bullshit divine gifted luck can get them out of. To put it in layman terms, dwarves are the "he said no pickles" to the halflings. "Oh, I didn't want pickles, but I guess it's fine." Finally, the final one in the list of BFFs is humans, and that's because humans generally can hang with everyone, but they're like uniquely suited to get along with dwarves. They're both known as the industrious species. Humans are also extremely communal. Humans also care about tradition and family and structure their lives around groups of people. Humans and dwarves were meant to be. Tolkien made it so dwarves and elves don't get along, but I think that people don't realize that that's mostly, very, very modern history in that setting. I mean, they're not similar, but they only start to truly hate each other somewhat recently. In D&D, dwarves don't hate elves because dwarves generally don't hate a lot of people. They're busy buying beard oil and opening Pandora stores in malls across the plains. But it's not like dwarves and elves get along great either. Culturally, they're sort of polar opposites. Elves are individualistic, flighty, mercurial, free spirits that paint with all the colors of the wind. Most elves do not live in community, which is the cornerstone of dwarven society. Literally everything cultural about the elves is the opposite of what dwarves care for. However, this doesn't mean that they hate each other. They have vastly different outlooks on how one should lead their own life, but they would 100% come together to face bigger threats, all the while disagreeing on how to go about that every single step of the way. So I guess they're closer to siblings than everybody else. The traditional rivalry of dwarves are orcs, in D&D at least, and this is for a myriad of reasons. Just like elves, orcish culture is sort of set up to piss a dwarf off, but the difference here is that while a dwarf is not forced to confront an elf basically ever, since elves are busy guarding the wisdom of the ages while on their mystical magical yoga retreat in the forest, dwarves and orcs share a territory. Since orcs traditionally like to live in caves for reasons explored in my orc video, go watch it, this, coupled with both dwarves and orcs being 100% down to throw down, makes it so that they generally don't get along. Also, if you like the whole alignment thing for some reason, dwarves are good and orcs are bad, and so they fight. Wow, incredible world building, so much better. Okay, enough lore. Can you tell I like these guys? I never talk about lore this much. Anyway, all this history and cultural context and blah 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 is good and all. But what can dwarves do actually? Let us take a look at that. And by us, I mean the guy that reads books for me. Human familiar! Human familiar! I wanted to shave my beard, and I didn't just for this video. So I hope you appreciate the commitment. You can't do a dwarf video beardless. So for abilities, I'm gonna go with the 2024 one because that's the newest one and I like that one better. So what do the short kings get? Well, they get dark vision, just like, say it with me, every single D&D thing under the sun. Except dwarves get extra good dark vision in that it extends 120 feet instead of 60 for long bathroom trips at night. It makes sense for them though, they live in caves. If anyone should get this, it should be them. They also get 30 feet of speed, they used to get 25 before. God bless for the change, look at those short kings go. Okay, on to the fun ones. We have dwarven resilience. You know that like tired thing about like dwarves love beer and that like every fantasy thing does? In an actually genius move on the designer's part, they made that into a mechanic thing. Dwarves get resistance against poison damage and advantage against being poison checks. Like they literally do not process alcohol as other races. That's sick. It's thematic, it makes sense for the popular culture's idea of dwarves, and it's an actually good gameplay ability. What more could you want? And it's really good because poison is an extremely common damage type. You will 100% encounter it. They also get dwarven toughness, which means they get a +1 to HP every single time they level up. You don't know how good this is. If you think that this is small, you have not been paying attention. This is basically half of the tough feat for free. It's an extremely strong ability. It's great, but not as great as Stone Cunning. This used to be an extremely situational ability for dwarves, and now it's probably the best ability that dwarves ever get. Stone Cunning gives your short king or your short queen or your short monarch tremor sense. For those that don't know, tremor sense lets you know the location of a creature by vibrations. This bypasses everything. As long as this thing is touching the ground in any way, it bypasses illusions, it bypasses invisibility, everything. As long as this thing is touching the ground or the ceiling or anything, you know where it is. I would even rule it that, like, because of tremor sense, if you see an illusion, right, and you do not feel any tremors, you would instantly know that that's an illusion, right? Like, if it was really there, you would know because you would sense it. It's amazing. But what about sub-races? Well, now that it's species, it's called a lineage, and dwarves don't really get a lineage, but they do, kinda. It's basically its own completely different species. And we're gonna talk about it, because there's plenty to say about them. The Duergar, or how do you pronounce this again? Oh god. Duergar? Dwergar. I'm glad they made it easy. Dwagar. Dwagar seems easier. I'm going for Dwagar. It sounds like, House of the Dragon. Vhagar! Dwagar are sort of the emo/goth cousins of the dwarf, and they were given a big update back in the Mom Book days, so that's why we're talking about them. The Mom Book was like basically right before the complete new switch to the core book, so they are way more in line with the new core books than like older D&D books, which I think is why it's important to look at them. Dwagar are sort of the evil Shadow the Hedgehog boys to the normal dwarves. If you're an edgelord and you somehow want to play like a 5' nothing little man, it's the one for you. Dwagar live in the Underdark, which is different from dwarves that live underground. Yes, it's different. It's different. It's underground, but more. One day we'll do the videos about places. I can't believe I have gone this long with only doing one. But the last one took a very long time and I had a whole adventure to it, so I don't want to do it. But we're getting really close to 500k, so subscribe if you want to see me suffer. Anyway, because the Underdark is, how do you say, bad? The Dwagar are also bad. In the world of D&D, living underground somehow makes your skin darker and purple. Literally the opposite of actual biology. And the Dwagar do follow the dark purple rule. They're also bald. Hi, bald. And it's explicitly stated that female Dwagar do not grow beards. You know what that means? You know what that means, right? If it is explicitly stated that these ones do not grow beards, that means that the other ones do, because they wouldn't say this if that was not the case. Checkmate, beardless! Dwagar are also said to be skinnier than their cousins a little ways above, and they are supposed to be sneaky, as opposed to dwarves, who are more about like square up and meet me at the parking lot kind of species.
Fight me! Square up!
Also, it has been a minute. I almost missed this. Dwagar love internships. I was wondering when that will show up again. We've gone too long without it. They might have picked this up from their friends, the Mind Flayers. And by friends, I mean mortal enemy that they put to the sword on sight. The reason why the Dwagar are like that is in fact Mind Flayers. Maybe that's where they got the purple from? Originally, the Dwagar were just a clan of normal dwarfs, but they got extra salty when they lost the America's Next Top Dwarf King competition that the dwarves were running. That's a great explanation. I'm really good at explaining things. What do you mean? The Dwagar lost their Mr. Beast challenge, and in an extremely petty move, they just went deeper underground than the others and refused to come out. And because they were so isolated from other dwarves, it was extremely easy for the Mind Flayers to find them, take them, do Mind Flayer stuff to them, and for other dwarves to not help because they didn't notice they were gone. Because they were being drama queens 3 kilometers deeper than anyone else. Because the Mind Flayers did their thing for generations, Dwagar developed psionic abilities, which seems to be a thing for anything that is ever like touched by a Mind Flayer, looked by a Mind Flayer, in the general vicinity of a Mind Flayer. As a result of developing these psychic abilities, the Dwagar were able to rise up against their oppressors and gain their freedom. But unfortunately, after all of this, they became this extremely militaristic
Pause.
Wait. No, you can't fool me again. This is the GIF! This is the GIF again! This is just the GIF, but tiny! Abilities-wise, they replaced the resistance to poison damage and advantage on saving throws to avoid being poisoned, with advantage on saving throws to avoid being charmed or paralyzed, and any check to see through any illusion. The poison thing was good, but I think that this thing is even better. They also get the tiefling thing of getting like innate spells. The drow get this too. Maybe it's an Underdark thing. The littlest edgelord in the world gets Enlarge Reduce and Invisibility. Both of them amazing. This is quite strong, but they get a debuff. Sunlight sensitivity. Better bring SPF 374 every single time you leave the Underdark. As soon as the sun hits them, they get disadvantage on basically everything. It's very German tourist coded. Okay, we got it. Thank you, human familiar. What if we went back to January and made it a year-long break? That would be a really cool idea that everyone would love, I think. All in all, dwarves have always been one of the strongest options for players. And yet, as I said before, despite this and despite how much of a fantasy staple they are, they lag behind much newer options like tieflings and dragonborns, and they lag severely behind what are basically their counterparts, elves. We've looked at dwarven lore, dwarven abilities, dwarven lineages, and that's all well and good. But what if we figure out what's the problem with dwarves and give these guys a twist? So you want to play a dwarf.
Nobody tosses a dwarf.
Okay, so what is it? Why are dwarves not as popular despite the amazing exposure and PR their publicists no doubt paid for? Well, I think the reasons are, much like my talent, multifaceted and complex. Before I go into it, I want to make clear that dwarf is like my favorite D&D species, alongside tieflings. I am firmly on Team Dwarf. I love them. I've said this before on many videos, and with that being said, I think one reason is, and you know how much I care about this, and I suspect that a lot of people care a lot more than they think, aesthetics. People have specific aesthetics in mind when they decide on what they want to play, and I think dwarves more easily embody an aesthetic that is plainly less popular than the one embodied by elves. Once again, I love dwarves, but dwarves are not dexterous, dwarves are not lithe, dwarves are not graceful, dwarves are stocky, hairy, thick with two C's. Dwarves are not beautiful in that traditional sense of the word. They're not statuesque or imposing or grand. They are strong, short little guys, and yes, maybe they're not that cool looking, and maybe they're not that dexterous, and maybe they're a little bit on the chunky side, and maybe they grow hair in weird places, and maybe they look funny when they run, and maybe they're not that pretty or that good looking, and when I look at all of that, I am reminded of myself, and that's why they're my favorite. Wait, not me, in the sense that my point here is that while you can make a dwarf that is like dexterous and agile and graceful and beautiful, they don't lend themselves to that. You don't imagine a dwarf being that. You can say that they are, but they don't look it. And if you want to make a guy that is imposing and tough and scary looking, which I also believe is a less common fantasy than the graceful fighter one, but at least it's closer to what dwarves are, you have options that are not, you know, under 5 feet tall. So I think that aesthetics are a reason, but I don't think it's the only reason. I also think that dwarves have like this vague whiff of conservatism to them that might not be appealing to a ton of people. As in, because of their love of tradition and family and following the rules and yada yada yada, they might somewhat read as this, and people don't tend to think that sticking really close to tradition and fighting for the status quo is terribly inspiring and super radical and cool with a K. But I think this is just that, and interpretation, out of many you can make. You can spin their lore in as many ways as you want. Yes, you can take their whole thing as like traditional values, TM, I guess, but you can also just as easily take their whole penchant for community and the emphasis on the group rather than the individual in the completely opposite direction, a more red direction. What I'm saying is that while I get the initial vibe check, this doesn't have to be the case. Comrade Gimli or Trad White Thorin can very much be canon in your game. It's your choice. The world is your oyster. Hell, do both. Two different dwarven cultures interpreting the same core values in wildly different ways. That's already interesting. And speaking of interesting, I think that perhaps the biggest reason is that dwarves are not interesting enough, in that they're not alien enough. We talked about this. Dwarves get along great with humans because they are similar. When people throw elves into a setting, it's because they are so long-lived, they have such a different culture, and they look alien enough that it's very easy to imagine, let's say, great elven empire that worked in mysterious magical ways, completely different from today. And that empire is the reason why the plot of the campaign is happening now. But dwarves? Less so. They're more pedestrian, more normal, more real. There was an ancient dwarven empire, but it's less ancient aliens like the elves are, and more, I don't know, Spartans? Like cool, interesting, but not strange and novel and new, not fantasy enough. So what if we made it that? Don't get me wrong, as I said, I love dwarves, but what if we gave them the option to be this, while tying it to existing dwarven lore and dwarven identity? That is the big one. Not retconning, building upon what is already there, but taking it in a widely different direction so that you can base not just your own player character, but entire adventures and even world around. There's something I haven't touched on in my little dwarven culture summary, and I didn't touch on it because it's been absent for the game for like the past 4 editions. The dwarves' relationship to magic. In the first and second editions of Dungeons and Dragons, dwarves could not be wizards at all. They just couldn't, mechanically. The association with divine magic for dwarves comes from this time. There's not even representation of arcane magic in the dwarven pantheon, like no god of magic to be seen. Why? There have been many reasons, because Tolkien said so, chief among them. Who cares? This isn't Lord of the Rings. There's also wizardry being super associated with elves and wanting to set dwarves and elves as opposites. And there's also stuff like arcane magic being too volatile for dwarven tastes, which I call bullshit on. It's literally governed by formulas and materials. If dwarves can make magical artifacts, they can get down with the arcane. It's literally the same thing. Regardless of the reason, there's this hole in dwarven culture for the arcane. But what if there was an arcane aspect of dwarven culture once? What if this aspect was taken away from them, destroyed so thoroughly that it was wiped from their cultural memory? What if the reason why dwarves are so pious and hold on to their gods so tightly today is because, on some level, unconsciously but firmly, they remember losing one of those gods long ago, a dwarven god of the arcane that had more of a role on who dwarves are than was previously thought possible. Adamantine, coal, diamond, opal, gold, iron, jade, mercury. These, along with the ones you see scrolling on screen right now, are just a few of the material components used in the casting of spells. I counted myself. You know what most of them are? Over 70% of material components? Minerals and stones. The cornerstone of dwarven craftsmanship. What if we made dwarves arcane components? Let's go. The legends are true. Dwarves are made of stone, or rather, they were once. They were extracted from the earth from precious stones and molded into their shape by the gods that lovingly gave them sentience. But the original shape they molded dwarves into significantly differs from the one we know today. Dwarves in the past were made of stone or metals, and this led to two distinct appearances. Those that could trace their lineage to stone had skin that shined like minerals, vein like marble, and the gemstone that was used in their creation grew on their heads like hair. Those that were instead born off of metals had a metallic luster and shine to their skin, and molten metal flowed from their scalp and their lower jaw instead of hair. At this stage of dwarven history, dwarves mined not for crafting, but for reproduction. They found gemstones and infused them with magic so that one day it would grow into another dwarf, and the magic they used was none other than arcane magic. The dwarves once worshipped a dwarven deity of the arcane, but also of fertility, since this is how they reproduced. This god was a motherly figure to contrast Moradin's paternal place in the pantheon, and the arcane was associated not only with knowledge, but with child rearing. It was through this deity's guidance that the dwarves mastered the art of the arcane, and then turned it from an art to a science. At this point in time, magic practitioners could only ask the weave of magic to do as they wanted. The dwarves, on the other hand, made the weave do what they wanted. They were crafters like the dwarves of today, but crafters of spells, the first to jot down formulas and measure arcane components to craft the first spells. And they used what was most at hand to craft these spells, the gemstones and metals that made up their own bodies. They chiseled the gems of their beards and poured the metal of their hair, and with it, they made magic. And under the guiding hand of their arcane god, they became the first arcane experts. And then, this deity vanished. There's a gap in the records of the dwarves, a gap wide enough to have made them forget that they were ever born of stone. Their previous appearance and way of life was sundered, erased along with this mysterious deity, and this deity's even more mysterious death. There are many theories as to how this happened. Some say this god was Moradin's consort, and something made the dwarven god mad with anger, mad enough to destroy his partner and erase the memory of the dwarves that worshipped them, leaving them orphaned from one of their parents and completely loyal to the living one, vaguely aware they had lost something extremely important, but not what that important thing was. Others say that the disappearance was at the hands of the now crazed Grumsh and the evil magics of his wife. And others believe the reason behind the disappearance was a rivalry between Corlon, the god of elven magic, and the god of dwarven magic. A rivalry that ended with Corlon victorious after casting a spell that would destroy the dwarves' connection with all of arcane magic, including the connection with their god. Whatever the reason for their disappearance, something had severed the connection between dwarves and the arcane completely. No longer able to harvest magic components from their own bodies, and with no divine guidance to practice their magic, not even being able to remember that they once did practice magic, one would think that dwarves would simply ignore spellcraft and the arcane completely. But the industrious spirit of dwarves is stronger than the hardest stone. dwarves turned back to mining, not for child rearing, but to find the gemstones and metals they once came from to follow the spells they had once written themselves, despite not remembering doing so. When once they crafted spells, dwarves now learned to craft artifacts, and in time, through centuries, the dwarves found their own way back to the arcane. Nowadays, few dwarven scholars even believe in the dubious theory that dwarves come from stone, and even fewer of them believe that dwarves were once metallic or gem-like in appearance. Except the newly found arcane connection that dwarves have forged has awakened something within them. There are whispers of dwarves being born of wizard parents that sport some of those gems on their heads and beards, or molten metal as hair. There are even rumors of clans of ancient dwarves that still have the same appearance that all dwarves once did, encased in stone, dormant, preserved like veins of precious metals and gems, ready for their brethren to mine deeper and liberate them from their earthen prison, so that they may tell the story of what exactly happened to the dwarven people. Okay, I know I'm a dwarf enjoyer, but I like this. Dwarves as the first spellcasters. Dwarves as the material components for spells. Dwarves as the reason why these material components are so often gemstones and minerals and metals. And it uses everything that dwarves already are. They're all about community, so arcane magic for them was literally about how to grow their community. And then later, once they were cut from this memory to find the naturally occurring gemstones, they themselves were once able to produce as arcane components. They're so religious because they lost the god that ruled over the domain of family and child rearing. They are orphans. Hell, the reason why dwarves care so much about their beards and their hair is because they used to use them for their spells. Is that silly? I don't know. I like it. Also, why couldn't you play a dwarf in 1st edition but you can now? It's because they are slowly regaining this connection, a throwback and explanation to super old edition lore, and a reason for mechanical limitations for dwarves not being able to be wizards in the beginning. I think that's cool. What's that? Yes, I did enjoy the dwarven lore in Dragon Age Veilguard. A whole lot. A whole lot. Why do you ask? And imagine the campaign and PC making opportunities. Going on a quest to restore the memories of the dwarven people, find out what happened to this mysterious god, who this god was, maybe restore the original connection that dwarves once had to the arcane. That's an amazing campaign idea. I want to play that. Or personal side quests inside of a bigger campaign. What about an evil wizard hunting the remainder ancient dwarves to use them as literal arcane components for a terrible spell? That's a sick motivation for a villain. What could a spell that requires literal humanoid spell components be able to do? I don't know. I guess it's a shame that these little guys exist only in this. Of course they don't! The ancient dwarves, both types, the metallic and the gemstone variants, are for you to grab in the description of this video for 100% certified pointy hat free. And if you like this whole extremely affected by spells, might I suggest the twist I gave to Genasi? These ones are based on schools of magic. And if you want to hear out the other side of the debate, check my orc video. People really dig the twist on that one. Alright, short kings, queens, and everyone in betweens. I'm off to the mines. I long for them in Minecraft. Bye! Mwah!